No.
Next time.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me here, guys. This talk, as you may have read in the abstract, is really about prioritizing application security assessments. So I was recently put in a situation, and from what I hear, it's a pretty common situation out there where you have tons of apps, or I'll qualify exactly what apps mean when I talk about it in this presentation, but you have a series of external facing domains that obviously pose some sort of risk to your organization, and you have a compressed or condensed schedule, and you have to get it done in time, whether it's budget constraints, whether it's resources, or it's just a matter of money, resources, and time. So just a quick introduction. My name is Sabha Kazerooni. I'm a principal consultant with Security Compass. We're a consulting and training company focusing in application security. So, on a daily basis, I work on a lot of security strategy, doing threat modeling, source code review, as well as the pen test side of things. So this one really, focuses on the pen test. And as I go through, I'll talk about the other methods as well. But really, we're going to be focusing on how do you actually pen test these from an external attacker's perspective. So before I start, quick disclaimer. When I talk about applications here, I'll start, what you'll notice is I'll start with a series of domains. And I really consider anything that's hosted on a web server out there and people interact with to be a web application. And we'll see why there can be threats even when you have static websites and when you have sites that maybe are unauthenticated. So we'll cover all of those, and that's really what our focus is on. We're not trying to just reduce the risk on the network and stuff. It's just really the focus is applications. The approach that we took to this problem, and this is really about the solution to a very complex problem. And the approach that we took here is just one approach. I figure that there'll be people with other approaches out there, and so your feedback and participation during the exercise or during the discussion, I want to hear feedback. If there's anything I say that you think you've seen something different, just feel free to yell them out or just raise your hand. Don't wait till the end, basically. So that's kind of my style. I do a lot of training, so I want to interact. So if you guys are okay with that, that's encouraged. Okay, so let's start at the top, the scenario. So here's position I was put in. Simple requirement, reduce the risk from all external facing applications. And this is really as detailed as it got. Basically, we were brought in to find out basically where does the risk lie, how can we fix the risk. And when you think about it, the problem is sometimes today organizations, they automatically prioritize applications and they say, we have compliance requirements, right? So we're going to assess only this application and not the other ones. But when you think about it, you have all of this attack surface out there that may just never be touched, right? Because it doesn't fall into any of these categories of high risk. But the problem is you don't really know if there's risk until you actually assess it. And some of the sites we assessed, they could be just as basic as a website, and they had some critical vulnerabilities on them. So I'll cover all of that as well. But basically, we have very simple requirement, and what we found out was there are 1,700 domains that the organization actually owns. Who here is kind of in a similar situation where your company has a lot of external facing domains? Maybe not 1,700 or pretty close to that? Yeah, so it's a very realistic scenario. And how do you find the domains, first of all? Well, what we started with was a list of domains that they own. So the organization already knew what domains they own, but they don't know what is actually being hosted on those domains. So that was part of our exercise. And trying to figure out, first of all, are these the only domains that we own? Because this list could be outdated, right? So we're lucky we even got that. And so first thing we did was we started looking at these domains. So we had a full list of domains, and we ran a bunch of scans just to see which domains are up and which ones are not, right? We kind of eliminated a good few of them. And one of the other things we did, and actually they suggested, was to maybe look on Google, right? We kind of created a little tool that goes out there and looking at these domains, it crawls around, it finds external domains as well, and we kind of add to our list. So in the end, we ended up with, I think, a little more than this, but not all of them were live. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So we obviously don't want to spend a whole year on this, right? You can spend, for each one of these apps, you can spend, even if you spend a day, right, you're spending too much time actually with the amount of risk that you're going to reduce. So the idea here is that we want to assess a large number of sites in a short period of time. So 40 days is what we were given. If you have, a couple of months or even 3 months, I think you're in a very similar situation. It's not, this may be a little exaggerated to what you may see, but I think you'll face some of the same challenges. So 1,700 domains, 40 days. Resources, just you, right? You have one guy. Here we have Jim, the one resource. He's the security guy on the team. And because of resourcing restrictions and budget, and obviously there's other stuff going on, right? They have other things to do. So you're the superstar. This is your job for the next 40 days. So you're very focused, and this is what you have to do. One thing that you do have is one license for industry app scanning tools. So whether it's WebInspect or Sensic, right? You can use any of those tools. So in our solutions, we'll consider that as well. Maybe we may want to use it. Maybe you don't want to use it, right? So it's just you. Good luck. So our challenges. I think our first challenge is obviously time is money. Right, so we got to make sure we do this in time. And even at 5 days an application, if you want to do a thorough assessment, and later I'll say that a thorough assessment is actually 10 days, and that's kind of the standard that we take. And when I say a standard assessment is an authenticated assessment of the website, right? So if there's certain apps out there that are authenticated, you spend 5 days on each, you're going to spend over a year doing this. So keep an eye on time, right? That was our first thing. And because of that, it really became a best effort basis. So we realized very early on that because of the time constraints, we can't get everything. So keep an eye on the time, and when the time runs out, you're done, basically. You can't go on. There's other things to be done. The budget is done. Our next biggest challenge was trying to figure out how to get the most bang for the buck. And the point here is you're trying to reduce the most amount of risk in the shortest amount of time. And so where do you focus all your efforts? Is finding one critical finding more valuable than 10 low-risk findings? Maybe, maybe not, depending on what you consider critical and your organization's policies. But what about 100? Finding one critical finding versus 100 low-risk findings? Is that something that you have a standard for, right? When you're actually doing these assessments, what are you going to focus on? Are you going to take that breadth approach, or are you going to really go in depth and only go for the critical ones, right? Are you actually going to look for a certain subset, or are you going to look for everything? What about 1,000, right? You have one critical, 1,000 low. Most likely if you're doing a full assessment, that won't be the case, but it's something to consider up front. And one of the things that we had to do, and it's part of the lessons that we learned, is that you really have to know what is critical in your organization, what is high, medium, low, and what's informational. And that's something we didn't have. So in this scenario, it was really us saying, they said, you're the experts, deal with it. At the end, tell us what there is. So we really used our own standards on what's critical and what's not. But I find that this is usually very lacking in organizations. You don't usually know what's critical, what's medium. So you kind of have to use your expertise there. OK, so what sites do we care about? Out of our list of 1,700 domains, static websites. Do we care about static websites? Sites that only serve static pages? Yes? Yeah, so you may have server-level vulnerabilities. So you have issues maybe on the web server that can cause a potential compromise. So yes, we do care about static websites. So that's going to stay in our list. What about unauthenticated websites? Sites that, it's just a company website. There's no authentication. There's no session management, nothing like that. Do we care? We care about unauthenticated websites. And one thing that we came across was you have content management systems, right? So the site isn't authenticated by using content management, and that's input, right? It takes input from the user. So really, it's We're not talking about static websites. This one here, dynamic websites, even if they're unauthenticated, are in scope. What about sites that right away forward to another site? As a user, you browse onto the site, and right away it pushes you to another site. Do you cut that site out? You don't, because you're still interacting with the web server, right? And sometimes what we found was the main site is forwarding to another site, but you have a whole load of functionality sitting behind it that if you know how to access it, the functionality is there, and you can actually interact with the web server. So sites that forward to others are in scope. What about sites that you can access over both HTTP and HTTPS? Are those, are they both in scope, or do you just take one? Both are in scope. So you have virtual hosts that can be sitting on the server, right? So even if the first page looks the same and it's the same site, you can access it with HTTP and HTTPS. Sometimes we found there were completely different apps, right? So for the domains that have both HTTP and HTTPS, all of a sudden we're increasing our domain count, right? So now we have more sites to test. It's not less. Okay, so all of these in scope. Some things that we can probably drop out, some of the domains, you have multiple domains resolving to the same IP, right? That helps us out quite a bit. So one of the things we did was at the very beginning, you basically scan all these sites and you correlate their IPs and you remove the ones that are duplicate. You just pick one to assess. Some of the sites don't host any applications. So these ones were just ones that weren't responding. The server was down, so we removed that. Some of the sites we found weren't actually operated by our organization. So they own the domain, but maybe as part of some service that they're offering to clients, they have a hosting service, and it's not really owned by us, owned and operated by us, so we don't have the right to actually scan these sites. So we need to figure out exactly which ones those sites are. That part turned out to be really painful because it's just a matter of manually going through the site and finding out which ones actually have the logo of our client or have some affiliation with our client to actually do that. So what we end up with is 400 domains, believe it or not. From our 700 list, we're down to 400. So 400 apps in 40 days. And up to now, I can say we've probably spent about 5 days probably figuring out which ones we do and don't need, creating the scripts, running them, eliminating them. So we're at 400 domains. So what do you do? At first you kind of look at it and you probably scratch your head a bit. Consider all your options. Whatever you're thinking, eventually you're going to come to a realization that you can't find everything. So I think most of us get that. The idea of this perfect security, this is one place where you just have to let it go. So we have to realize that whatever we do here is best effort, and we're going to use our judgment along the way quite a bit. So we're not going to just do everything. So we got to realize that. That's really important. Okay, so what are a few options that we have as far as doing this? Well, we considered a few options. The first question is, would you rather know nothing about everything or everything about nothing? So do you want to do this breadth assessment where you do a shallow assessment of everything, or do you just pick a small subgroup and assess those? And I think usually the standard, at least out there, is the organization will say, we want to assess this app and this app and that app, and let's do it thoroughly, right? You very rarely do this shallow type of assessment. What we did here, the results that we got were just, it really wasn't expected, but we'll get to that in a little bit, and we'll see that there's really advantages to both, right? And some, depending on the type of findings you're looking for, or the number of findings you're looking for, or overall risk that you're actually trying to mitigate. So, that's a tough question. Do we do the shallow assessment or the thorough one? And basically, if we kind of size it down, we have 4 apps and 4 days. Well, we can spend a day on each app or 4 days on one app, right? And most likely in app 4, we're going to be pretty secure. We're going to have a good idea of how this stands and the risk. But what about app 1, 2, and 3? And how do we pick app 4, right? How do we decide which one that is? So it's a big challenge. So application classification. Who here is familiar with classifying your applications on risk level? Few people. So basically what you do is you start to talk about every single one of your apps. You assign certain attributes to your applications, right? So some of the things you may want to consider: how many users are using this application? Is it an internal-facing app or is it external? And if it's internal, do we trust our internal users, or are we just going to focus on our external-facing apps? So in this case, we already knew that our focus was the external apps, so we didn't have to care about internal apps. But at your organization, if you want to do a full assessment, you have apps that are only available to internal users. What type of data is actually being stored in this application? So, you have an application that's dealing with credit card data. Well, because of certain regulatory requirements, right, that app may get some sort of preference over other applications. What about functionality? Within this app, can somebody possibly move money from someone else's account into theirs, if you're in a financial organization? Or is it just an application that lets you just view data, right? View data, which may have a little lower sensitivity level. So, classifying the applications is great. In the end, you have a good idea of which ones you care about and which ones you don't. It'd be really nice if this was already there, right? If you already had this idea and you could use that to your advantage. But unfortunately, we didn't have that. So that's one of the challenges. So again, with app classification, one of the ways that I've seen it done is, you assign a confidentiality, integrity, availability rating, and depending on the combination of these, you have certain policies that you then check against, right? So that can be your focus. You can say, if app X has really high integrity and availability, well, we got to make sure that there's certain level of logging that's happening and stuff. And that can, you can go into a very thorough assessment of that application, right? And this application will get priority over ones that are all low. So this is your standard app classification. It's very, very useful. If you're doing something like a number of 5 to 10 applications maybe, right, and you need to prioritize that. But with our 400 apps, we can spend 40 days just classifying the applications, right? How do you now have to talk to all these application owners, talk to administrators, what type of data is being used in your application, what's the functionality, all that stuff was just too overwhelming. I mean, from what I noticed, communicating to one application owner, and within an organization, you have tons, right? Every single one of these apps could be someone different. So, introducing yourself, and the question comes back, why do you need this? What are you trying to do? All that stuff, right? So at this point, we realize, we can't use this method because it's just going to take up too much of our time. So we just had to find something else. Can you just scan everything? So somebody asked me when I told them about our method and what we did, they said, hey, well, why don't you just take that app scanner that you have and feed in 400 applications and let it run, right? In 40 days, depending on how good your scanner is, maybe you'll be able to get it done. Do you guys think that's possible? 400 apps with a scanner? How long does it take usually? A day? 2 days. Here I said up to 8 hours. And this is really an optimistic assumption, I think, that you have apps that go way over 8 hours, right? Especially if you're trying to do an authenticated assessment, right? You have all that functionality inside. So, up to 8 hours in application, again, we're way over our time, right? Yes? I will get to that in a little bit. Sorry? I'm sorry, so you scan? When you're allowed to scan. Oh, which window are you allowed to scan, exactly. So certain apps, again, you run into the problem of, do you want to, once you talk to the owners, they may tell you, hey, don't touch it during peak hours, stuff like that, right? So luckily, the position we were in this organization is we kind of had the authority to do whatever we wanted, right, as far as security assessments. And the security team in this organization was pretty well respected. So, we had that advantage that we could do at any point in time. We could do any assessment as long as their security team was aware that we're doing this assessment. So, that can definitely be a challenge. Again, talking to the app owners and stuff is really a big deal. So, if you want to scan every application with a number of false positives, right, you can spend days, probably half the time, just revalidating findings. right? So it's really, really challenging. You know, how do you actually reduce this time with making sure that you're covering the risk? And we ran into, we actually did some level of app scanning, and we ran into these problem sites that just don't crawl. You know, the app scanner doesn't crawl them. Ones that are maybe JavaScript based, and the scanner is not good with that. And you know, every app scanner has its issues. So you have these problem sites to deal with. If you think, you know, why don't we do a source code review approach of all this stuff? Well, you know, source code review scan even, sometimes you have languages that, you know, aren't supported, right? So you can't cover every application with just a scan, right? And that was also part of the problem. Okay, so what did we do? Well, we did a lot of thinking, a lot of brainstorming. You know, we just had no idea. I mean, there was a time when we spent a good few days trying to figure out what was going on. A lot of frustration. But you know, we put our heads together, and we came up with what we thought was a pretty good solution. And one of the things that we really, you know, just kind of came up. Somebody talked about it, and we thought, hey, you know what? Let's think about that. We kind of started talking about the idea of, okay, instead of classifying applications, why don't we classify each application into its various components? Okay, so you know, this slide is, you know, there's a lot of app security veterans in this room, and you know, I know this may cause, it may be a little controversial, and I've spoken to some people about this approach and saying, okay, the parts that are facing the public, so before authentication, pose the greatest risk. Okay, so yesterday I was speaking to Adam Shostak, and he mentioned that, you know, in Microsoft they have what they call the attack surface, right? They really talk about the attack surface. Well, in the public parts of your application, your attack surface is the entire internet, right? And you know, your authenticated portions, I'm not saying they're not important. You have millions of users in there, right? But when you think about your traditional risk analysis, where it's impact and likelihood you're talking about, well, isn't an SQL injection in the public part of your site higher likelihood than an SQL injection on the inside of your site, right? So the higher the likelihood, the higher risk we're possibly catching. So, you know, at a very high level, we said, okay, if obviously any same vulnerability exists on the outside than the inside, it's, you know, more dangerous, right? So it's higher risk because anybody can do it. And we were finding already that from the logs, people were hitting a lot of the unauthenticated portions of our sites, trying to catch SQL injection issues and cross-site scripting and all the good stuff. And you know, certain sites, certain parts of the sites, imagine a cross-site scripting on the login page is a lot more dangerous than a cross-site scripting on the inside of the site, right? So you may think, okay, well, if I have cross-site scripting on the inside, you know, out of all the things I can do, one of the things I can do is grab someone's session, right? Well, there's a few defenses against that, but if you think about it, if there's cross-site scripting on the login page, you can capture somebody's credentials, right? Which is a lot more dangerous. And we actually did a proof of concept of that as well, and you know, we could talk about that afterwards. But so we said, okay, the public-facing parts are most important. We're not going to say that other parts aren't important, and we're going to get to that. But the public-facing portions are very important, and authentication is very, very important. So we said, okay, if we can block out, you know, the public, we've kind of reduced a great amount of risk already. So that ended up being our major approach. Any objections? Yeah, so this is really our process that we came up with. So scan the server. That doesn't matter whether it's authenticated or unauthenticated. Scan the app unauthenticated. And you know, there are challenges to that as well. And I'll get into what type of things you can actually look for while unauthenticated. There's critical stuff you can still look for at that place. Validate the results. We still had to do that, but I think we reduced the number of findings or the number of actual results from our scans by just focusing on certain parts of a site and not other parts of the site. Validate the results. Assessing the login forms. You know, when we were first coming up with this methodology, we weren't too confident in our scanners. right? And we thought with the sensitivity of a login page and the login functionality, we want to assess the authentication portion separately, right? And that's one part we're actually going to do manually. So we're going to make sure that it has this very solid exterior, and I know it goes completely against the principle of defense in depth, right? But we're really here looking for that egg and not the onion, right? I mean, when you're condensed to this type of time frame, sometimes you have to take the one that is going to reduce the most risk, and that turned out to be the one for us.
So you make this decision, okay, the most probable objects to be leveraged are the public ones, fine, okay? Not that the damage will, I know you're not saying that the damage would be any less, but what I'm getting at is, how did this reduce your workload? So you had 400 apps, what did this bring it down to then that you're going to decide to scan?
Well, every app has an unauthenticated portion, so we're still at 400 apps, but we're reducing the amount of surface within each app that we assess. So we possibly cut it down, I want to say, to a quarter of the attack surface. So if we wanted to authenticate, we have 75% of the functionality inside, and then you have the unauthenticated portion. So it actually reduced the amount of time we spend scanning. It reduced the amount of time we spend validating results. And also, not to say that we didn't do manual assessments as well. I'll get to you in a minute. Oh, okay. Not to say we didn't do a manual assessment, but that was actually the next step, saying based on what we found so far, we flagged sites of interest. So these were sites that we had reason to believe that on the inside they were going to be just as bad as on the outside. So really up to that point, up to assessing the login forms, we're really skipping over 75% of the functionality. Now, think about, again, I bring up SQL injection, but SQL injection on the outside, whether you're retrieving data or not, whether you can see data or not, even blind SQL injection, you can basically enumerate the database, right? You can start pulling data from the database. You just need the one. So outside, inside, it's really the same risk level to the organization. Yes?
In your prioritization methodology, did you take into consideration the attacker and what their capabilities were? Because some attackers have different capabilities and have certain end goals. Some are just network noise, other ones have a scanner like you guys do.
Yeah.
And other ones will want to attack that one particular target and spend a year on it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, we came to that decision together, actually. We thought about, okay, the thing was there's certain functionality that, may be really lucrative for an attacker to leverage, right? Like I was mentioning, let's say you're an online bank, move money, right? Moving money. You could spend, days on that. But, it all came down to, how we kind of assess risk. And I agree certain functionality on the inside may be higher impact if it happens, but yeah. So the attack, we did a lot of manual assessment as well on the login forms and stuff. So it was really, in the time that we were given, there's no way you can do, you can emulate an attacker that's sitting there, for days trying to attack you. So again, it's about prioritization, right? So one of the things we did do, though, in the flagging the sites of interest is saying, hey, this site looks like it could be lucrative if an attacker got in. So again, I'll talk a little bit about how we actually flagged sites, but that was one of the things as well. Yes?
Another question regarding scanning the app. Did you make any distinction at that point between static and dynamic sites?
Scanning the application, no, we didn't, just because we basically ran the scanner on all the apps, and our assumption was that if a site is static, it's just going to scan in a lot faster time, and we would save time than going through and looking at every site ourselves. So we scanned every application, all 400 domains we scanned. And we scanned with the server all 400 domains. So we kind of eliminated that manual elimination piece. So we really relied on the scanners and some manual assessment. Yes?
The point that you made before about the 25%, 75% of the functionality, does that tip the scale of the attack surface back towards the inside of the network? Yeah, there's going to be fewer people that get it, but there's so much more functionality. The outside of your website might only have that login page and some marketing materials and some other stuff where all the rich functionality, all the interactivity is going to be on the inside. So that's really where the attack surface is.
Yeah, so the attack surface, Yeah, the attack surface as far as functionality versus user base, yeah, they're completely different, right? We really took the approach that, if somebody out there is trying to attack you, they're going to try to do it anonymously, and it's going to be most likely they're going to. And from what we were seeing, most of the attacks were coming from the outside. So I agree. There's quite a bit of functionality that we aren't assessing, and it's on the inside. But again, in a best effort basis, it's it all comes down to a matter of how much can you catch in a short amount of time. And if you can just hang on to that thought, and when we talk about the results, I actually do a comparison to if we were going to do a thorough assessment versus if we were going to do just the unauthenticated pieces. So you do catch, it's all about how much risk you think you can catch on each side.
Did you have a conversation with the client to the effect of 40 days you guys are out of your mind? Let's be realistic here. Here's what we can do in 40 days, but if you want to actually do the job right, it's 3 times.
Yeah, they understood that. The client understood what we were doing, and we actually have we have various levels of testing that we do. So we actually have 4 or 5 different types of assessments that we offer. This, I got to say, was a first. I mean, this type of time frame we had never come across before, but it was just a budget thing. It was really a budget thing, and part of the reason was that none of the app owners or none of the application, none of the departments or business wasn't paying for this. It was the security team that was paying for this. Right, so they have a limited budget. They're very proactive, right? They realize that, hey, there's all these sites we may never get to, so let's do them right now. You can keep putting it off, but let's do it right now. So that was the motivation for them. Yes?
It occurred to me to ask the same question: are these people out of their minds? The second question was, are you out of your mind for taking the case? The third question is, what did they really hope to get for the money?
Based on their requirement that they were giving us, they trusted us as experts, and they said, with this budget, how much risk can we reduce, kind of thing. So,
Give us the answer in a little while.
Sorry?
You're going to give us the answer in a minute, how much risk you actually
I'll let you know how much risk we actually ended up reducing in the time frame. So.
how you validated that?
Validation of the risk is something else. I agree. I mean, just because we have a certain attack vector doesn't mean it would have been exploited over the year.
It's not a fair question.
Yeah, I'm trying to dance my way around it, but yeah, I know what you're saying. I mean, it's you have a certain risk that as security professionals we know it's there, and whether it would have been exploited, but we had reason to believe that any number of these sites were actually being attacked on a daily basis. So
they were hoping that your findings, whatever they're going to turn out to be, to leverage that to either get something done, get the business unit's attention, or something like that.
correct. Yeah. So based on what we found, there was going to be they were trying to highlight places where they would say, hey, look, these guys found so much stuff in this amount of time. These ones are worth to assess more thoroughly.
It starts to make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I probably should have clarified that. But no, that's a very good point. So they knew what they were getting into. They were just really relying on our expertise to get the most risk. So I want to step through each of the phases very quickly. Scanning the server, we basically use NIC2. I mean, it's there's various scanners out there, and we found out that web app scanners can do that as well. They have the server level scanning. Really, the type of things we were looking for were the hidden files and directories, the information disclosure, known vulnerabilities on the server. This is really hardening the server, right? Looking for things that may be left behind that could be leveraged. Backup files, hidden functionality, things like that. Also looked at which HTTP verbs we have available to us. Can we arbitrarily download and upload files, using HTTP. So we actually found quite a bit of stuff using this scan as well. But really, our focus was, in the next phase, which was at the application level, right? But we felt that, especially the static websites, we had to do something like this at a minimum, right? And find out whether the servers are hardened. So here, we're scanning the application. So we used our enterprise license here of the scanner that we had, and it was an unauthenticated scan. Again, we didn't want to go through the hassle of getting our username and password from all the app owners, which wasn't going to happen. So, the scanners are really good at reflective cross-site scripting. SQL injection, it turned out to be really good at. The scanner we're using, and we can talk offline afterwards. I don't want to get into a debate of what scanner is good and what's not, but there were certain things that it really helped out with SQL injection. We found there were some non-SSL forms, so we had passwords being passed around in clear text, basically. You don't think you'd see that anymore, but when you have 1,700 domains, 400 sites, and no standards, somebody's going to do it, right? And we actually caught those people. We found quite a few people that were doing that. We actually found passwords that weren't masked, right? This is stuff that you think you would, get right by now, but it's out there. And session management, usually most apps, your typical app, I'm not going to say every app, but they'll assign you a session ID at login, right? So we could assess the strength of a session ID, the randomness. We could look at the cookies, how they're being passed around, things like that. So the scanner really helped us with some session management stuff that we were able to use. One of the things we couldn't check for was things like session fixation because it requires login, right? There was certain things that we just couldn't check for. And open redirects through the public site are very dangerous for phishing. So we kind of caught those as well. So things we couldn't look for, privilege escalation, because we just didn't have roles. We weren't looking at functionality that we can access outside of our role. Password complexity issues, there were places where it was obvious. It was obvious. Actually, I should have probably put this in the manual assessment of the login form. But when we did the manual assessment of the login form, some places you can tell based on error messages if they have deficiencies in password complexity. You could tell if they have issues with account lockouts and stuff based on error messages that you get back. So this should have actually all been a little further out. But stored cross-site scripting, I would think that most of the unauthenticated portions, they wouldn't be storing anything and redisplaying it later, which turned out to be the case. And the scanners really aren't good at that. So we didn't test that. And business logic flaws in the functionality itself, like trying to leverage, modifying hidden fields and things like that to actually abuse the functionality we couldn't do. So this is some of the stuff that we just had to skip over. I kind of skipped over the validating results, but it's just mainly, too long, our scanner turned out to be pretty good. So the login forms, again, we thought you have to have a manual review. And over here, we didn't have too much faith in the scanner, even though it did find SQL injection issues, but we actually did further testing on all the login forms. So we actually had a list of the login forms that we could attack. And user enumeration, sometimes, again, based on the messages that you get, you can tell there could be user enumeration. But it's very hard when you don't have a valid user. But sometimes you can tell that there's various messages that the app throws around. So based on that, we found quite a few of those. And forgot password is one place that I think is really deficient in most web apps. And we spent a lot of time just looking at how is that implemented. Does it send you an email? Is there user enumeration there? Does it ask you secret questions, things like that, based on what we could, right, with what we had. We didn't have user roles and user credentials, so it's a little difficult. So based on what we had done so far, there's a few factors on deciding what sites we want to do a more thorough assessment on. So we looked at systemic issues. So if on one site we had 2 or 3 input validation issues, we right away said, okay, you know what, we need to either do a source code review on this, and we didn't actually do the thorough assessment and source code review here, but this was leveraged to actually get a more thorough assessment later, right? So we actually provided this information, and basically, if you see a lot of severity of findings, that's when you know this app has issues and you want to do a more thorough assessment. So we actually flagged 5. You have to be careful here because based on a number of findings that you have, you could highlight any number, but really they were looking at us to say where is the most risk based on what you've seen. And it's kind of hard for us to tell what's on the inside, but based on what we had seen, we were able to highlight 5 that looked really bad. Okay, the results. How,
Still nervous.
how many findings do we have? Any guesses?
So unauthenticated scans.
Well, valid findings. Valid after revalidation.
6%. So,
It's a little less than that. We had 415 findings. So, the skeptics, I know there are probably skeptics out there that are saying, well, what does that mean? Could your time have been spent better elsewhere? Well, if you do a comparison, I typically say that if you want to do a thorough assessment of one app, you're going to spend about 10 man days. That's pretty typical. That's how we do things. So in our 40 days, we could assess 4 apps, and from our average for our assessments, I want to say is roughly 10 findings. High, medium, critical, whatever they are. So 40 findings we could have possibly found if we had done thorough assessments, right? And maybe even bump that up to 100, right? You have 100 findings versus the 415 that we had here. So
Of the 415, what was the breakdown of critical?
thank you. Yeah, and I know everyone was thinking that as well. Well, it turns out we had close to 50 high and critical findings, right? So, previously I said we would have found 40 findings for a full assessment. Those aren't all high and critical. But in this assessment, we had just under 50 high and critical level findings. So it's true that we found a lot of low level findings, but when you actually start looking at the ones that really matter, and the critical findings are, I'll talk about on the next page, but things like SQL injection, remote command execution, things like that. So we actually did find quite a bit of high risk. And if you compare this to what you could have done in the same amount of time, I think you'd agree that this is enough risk. We've basically, I don't want to be patting myself on the back, but it's a lot of risk that you catch in 40 days. So I can't guarantee that everyone doing a similar type of assessment will find this, but our results show that our time was well spent here actually doing this assessment. Yes?
How many applications did those critical findings map to?
I want to say at least, the critical ones, it would have been, I think there was about 12.
Critical and high.
Yeah, critical and high. I want to say about maybe just under 20 of them had some critical and high risk findings. Every application had at least one finding. I can probably say that safely. There were some that I guess there were a few that just had nothing really. It was just public sites that were all done pretty well. So the ones that were high and critical, a small subset, but you end up assessing more apps than if you had taken that other approach. So types of vulnerabilities, there were actually a lot of SQL injection.
Did you have the pleasure of being able to go back and actually going through some of those sites with an authenticated scan at that point? So, I mean, you made this decision, fine. What do you think you would have found if you had been able to do a thorough analysis on all of them?
If I could have done a thorough analysis, out of the 5 that we highlighted, they were the ones that had high and critical findings. So I would have expected to find systemic issues in things like SQL injection. So I would have expected to really bump up the high level ones for sure, high and critical.
So you thought you would have found more high and critical level vulnerabilities?
If we had taken the final step of actually doing the thorough ones based on what we found here. Because you can't really take a shot in the dark and say I'm going to take this one and that one and that one and do a thorough assessment. You have to base that on something. And this really allowed us to say this site has issues, systemic issues, so it needs to be assessed more thoroughly. Yes?
The applications that had critical, high and critical, did you find multiple higher critical vulnerabilities in those same applications?
In the authenticated or unauthenticated portions?
Basic scan.
Yeah, there were some that had a couple of high and critical, and that kind of fed into our flagging of sites. If we thought it was systemic, we actually definitely used that as one of the factors. Yes. Oh shoot! Sorry. Before I forget, I'm trying to give out these really beautiful USBs. So. Pretty good ratio in this room, but I'm doing a draw at the end before I forget. We actually have we have a newsletter that if you're interested in, it's an application security newsletter, not Security Compass related. It's we just talk about stuff in the industry. So if you put your card in there, I'll do a draw for 4 afterwards. So if you can just pass it around, please. Sorry, should have done that earlier, but realize we're coming to the end. So types of vulnerabilities, obviously there's some serious ones. SQL injection issues, remote command execution, arbitrary file download, all of which are pretty dangerous. A lot of cross-site scripting, non-SSL passwords, and weak authentication, and all the others, right? So this was kind of, I picked some of the top ones. We obviously had a lot more types of findings.
They kind of matched your data from last, doesn't it?
Go back.
Yeah. Really, big prevalence of cross-site scripting.
Yeah. Well, cross-site scripting, it's still, I mean, we know that SQL injection is now the most common attack, right? But cross-site scripting is still the most prevalent, so it definitely matches that. Sorry? You can't see it actually, right? Yeah, unless you have proper logging. And wow, it's pretty good odds for 4. Okay. Okay. So a couple of lessons learned. You know, I thought the tool that we used was great. However, we found you know, at least 5 SQL injections that our tool didn't find. So really there is some value there in us having gone back and done the manual assessments on the login pages. So there was a few pages where you can actually log in with cross-site scripting. So really important to actually do the combination of the two. You can't just rely on the scan. Again, I'm not getting into that debate, but we really learned that lesson here. Talking about, you know, the policies or knowing your exposures and liabilities, it would have been really, really nice if we had the classification of where your data sits, what the sensitivity of that data is. It would have allowed us to actually do that prioritization a lot faster and actually possibly take a different approach, right? So if we did have that to use to our advantage, we probably could have taken a different approach, done more thorough assessment of certain applications, which some may say is more standard out there as you know, for this type of assessment. The security policy is going a long way. We found that, you know, we didn't know what was high, critical, and you know, medium, so we couldn't focus our efforts on what to test for. We just kind of had to you know, take our guess on what we thought was the most important and just kind of went with that. But if you do have the security policies that say, you know, every application has to have this, this, and this, well, we can just check for those things, right? And you kind of reduce the work of, or you reduce the reliance on the person that's actually doing the assessment. And the final one was kind of really important, no time to investigate. There were times where we found some vulnerabilities that we thought were exploitable, and you know, if you think about it, you can spend an hour or two trying to actually prove an SQL injection issue. But you know, the first few we spent a lot of time doing, and we kind of assumed that, you know, based on what we had seen there, if it was doable, we actually passed it off as a vulnerability, and in most cases, it actually was a vulnerability. So we actually, you know, skipped the time to investigate so thoroughly, and that only goes for assessments like this, right? You're not going to do that with a more thorough assessment. You definitely want to investigate it. But when you have limited amount of time, you can cut out on the investigation, assume that your instinct is right, and you kind of go with that, and that worked for us. So, you know, those were the biggest lessons. It was definitely interesting. I want to hear feedback if you guys have any. I know there's different ways of approaching this, but you know, that's how we did it. And yes.
Did they take into account, like, what was their strategy for remediation, retesting? Are they going to bring it back next year? Did the same exercise?
We did. As we were doing this, we were kind of sending out vulnerabilities as we found them. So a few of them came back right away, and we did revalidate it. So yeah, it did eat up a little bit of time, but ideally in a situation like this, you want to keep that as a separate effort. Definitely.
Did they plan for that? They'd have to fix whatever you found?
Yeah. So they have to fix it. There's a certain, they're given a time span that they have to fix it by. So after that, again, I'm not sure if we're going to do the revalidation, but they have it in their tracking, right? So whatever they use for their standard revalidation. Yes.
Regarding the fix, did you go through the classification process and ask, are these vendor programs or are these custom programs? And what were the decision-making process around that?
Yeah, so we had a list of application owners. We knew who was responsible for the app internally, and we basically left that part to them. If your question is whether, we decided whether this was internally developed or was a vendor issue. So if we could tell it was a vendor issue, let's say it was a common server problem, then we highlighted that. But in most cases, we just said, here's what we found, and basically a lot of times it came back to us. We did a lot of back and forth, which again eats up a lot of time. But we didn't necessarily try to find out what the root cause was or anything. We just said, here's what we found.
So you didn't go through that process on the front end, only during the vulnerability assessment?
Correct, yeah. Just as we went along, we just kind of passed it on, dealt with the owners. Any other questions? Yes?
Is this something that either you have used since then or I guess would use in the future as sort of a first cut against, if somebody came to you again and presented you with 17 or something like that? Do you think that this would be sort of a useful methodology if you were given more time, but to at least to use this as a general way of narrowing down what you want to concentrate on? Or do you think that you go more to sort of a more standard methodology?
I'm a big fan of what we did here, to be honest. But again, in the given time, I would say if we were given the same amount of time, there were a lot of factors that went into making this decision. So if they actually have application classifications, like I mentioned a few times, I may consider taking a few of the highest risk applications along with this. However, I do see value in doing at least a little bit of testing on every site. So yeah, I mean, since then, I think this was a good approach. I tried to get people's feedback on it, and I think the results kind of speak for themselves, and that's why I really think in a short amount of time, there's only limited testing that you can do, and the thorough assessments are good if you have to do it for let's say compliance reasons, or you think there may be risk, but sometimes you think there's risk, but is there really risk there? You think this site, because it has a lot of functionality and has a lot of users, it doesn't necessarily mean that assessing that site will give you the most amount of risk. You'll highlight the most amount of risk. So you're kind of taking that chance sometimes when you pick apps to assess thoroughly. So I'm going to say if I had more time, I would do a little bit of both. But I think this approach definitely has its value as well. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to do a quick draw. Wow, this is... Okay, here we go. Got 2 there. Okay, we have Andrew Ward. There you are. No problem. Peter O'Malley. Congratulations. Oh, there you are. Jeremiah. And Michael Don, I think. Okay. There you are.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. There. Okay, so I guess we can talk offline if you guys have other questions, but thanks for your time. Thank you.
We're going to do 290 days.
Oh, really? Sorry.